Good evening, everybody. My name is Vanessa Richards, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. I really appreciate that you took the time out of your lives to come and hang out with us for 90 minutes while we explore something that I'm hoping you will find as fascinating as we all do. As Laura mentioned, we do have something a little unusual apparently for the talks. It made perfect sense to me when I suggested it, and that was like, well, let's have the books related to our theme in the room. So they really, it's not typical that they take them outside of the main building because of how the scanning and everything works, but I really invite you, if you have the time afterwards, to take a look at the collection, because one of the things that's so exciting about doing a partnership with the library is that, you know, theater is built on all this research, all this work, all this thinking, this whole history of not only our city, but the history of the form itself, all of which is contained and housed in this magnificent building. And so I really wanted to illustrate that we have a simpatico relationship with our partner here at the Vancouver Public Library. And we started this three-part series as part of our 50th anniversary season. This year is the 50th season that the Arts Club has presented in the city of Vancouver. We're the largest theater company west of Toronto. And I don't know if we're the oldest in the region anymore, but I believe that we might be. This to say, we've had a significant history in this place. So it's been able to have 50 years because audiences come, because people like you show up. So I want to applaud you being the people who are shower-uppers. This makes the world go round. All of us really love you for that. So this evening, I'm really excited about the presentation because with my work as a community engagement manager, a lot of what I'm thinking about is how can the theater company, the Arts Club Theater Company, be of service to the broadest community, beyond our ticket holders and our subscribers and the people that come to us every once in a while, but how are the ideas that we're thinking about, how might we lift the curtain, open the doors, and have a bigger conversation. So some of the things that I've been looking at are around our themes, our content, the kind of technology that we're using, and on the case with Helen Lawrence, there's so much meat to it, and I'm really thrilled to be able making an exploration with you around this. Let me tell you what we've been doing around this show. So as you can see, it opens March 13th, and it's on our big stage. Who here has been to the Arts Club before? I see some of us regulars. Oh, great. So did you hear about it through the Arts Club email? Did anybody get it on their Facebook by accident and say, hey, that sounds fascinating, I'll show up? Oh, because apparently it showed up on 47,000 email Facebook feeds today. So that helps me understand if that $110 investment was awesome. So thank you to the Arts Club audiences who read your email invitations. Great. So Helen Lawrence, look at that. So Vancouver Confidential, you'll see that's also the name of some of the authors that you'll be hearing from tonight, and I will introduce you to them. So, some of you may have heard me talk a little bit about Hogan's Alley. Helen Lawrence is a story set in Hogan's Alley and the old Vancouver Hotel. It's a story about a woman who's been falsely accused of murdering her husband, and she's come to piece it together. She's come to Vancouver in 1948 for justice, shall we say? Now, it's interesting how memes show up in history. Some of my friends, Wade Compton was a writer in residence here at the Vancouver Public Library some years ago. He was part of a really important team of artists who worked on who had a mission to revive the history of Black Strathcona in our city, because quite often, you may have heard it yourselves, they say, oh, there's no black people in Vancouver. People will look at me in my black face and say, there's no black people in Vancouver. And I got family and friends. And so what was so interesting about the work that they did is that I believe that this Canada Post stamp, every year Canada Post commemorates a person or a place in Canadian history, Black Canadian history. This year they chose Africville in Halifax and Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. And I believe as part of the work that Wade Compton, who was artist in residence here, who's a poet, who's a thinker and a scholar, helped to revive this memory, our own local memory around the presence of a Black community in the area. Now, some of you might wonder, well, what happened to it? The Georgia Viaduct is what happened to it. And I expect some of our historians this evening will talk about how urban blight was remedied through new housing projects. And Vancouver started down that road, and that's why we don't see this neighborhood anymore. The street, the area, it was called Hogan's Alley, but the community was in Strathcona. And I have my friend Thelma Gibson. So this is, you'll see, is that same picture that's on the stamp. My friend Thelma Gibson, she was resident in Black Strathcona, and she was part of the community of dancers and entertainers there. And she'd say to me, she's 85 now, you'll see the back of her head in a moment, she'd say, you know, we didn't live in the alley. Doesn't like that. So I thought I'd reiterate that for her. It was an area, it was like an area for entertainment and gambling and good times. The other place where the show is set is the Old Hotel Vancouver. And the Old Hotel Vancouver, which we'll probably hear a little bit about this evening, in the case of Helen Lawrence, is housing war veterans who've come back from World War II. And just like our veterans of today, they were traumatized. And they were trying to make sense of their lives in a culture that had gone upside down. And we had all these quaint morality rules that nobody really followed. And in the face of this hypocrisy and prohibition, there was a lot of conflicting and dangerous human nature. And the hotel was abandoned and was becoming home to these veterans who were being housed there as a wayfare before they found their way out back into the world. So here, one of the things that we've done with the production, okay, so giving you a little snapshot of the story, murder mystery, set in Hogan's Alley, Vancouver Hotel, brothers, rivalry, police, crime, gangsterism, City Hall, those guys will take care of it. So one of the things that we've done with this production is that we've taken archival photographs of the city and we've rendered them in the computer. So that is a rendering. Yeah. This, at Winterruption this year, I did a special Stories from Hogan's Alley. Did anybody have a chance to see that? Awesome. So you guys are going to have the full experience of all of the Helen Lawrence piece. I so appreciate you showing up. This I just thought was such a beautiful picture. This is Obadiah Wonderful Jones Darrell escorting Thelma Gibson. She's a beautiful elder, as I mentioned, and he's escorting her onto the stage because she's 85. And I just loved how it looked as though she was walking down the alley. And in fact, that's kind of what it ends up looking like when you see the production, because the renderings are taking the place of the set. And I'll try and explain it in a very simple way, but mostly I'm just going to show you photographs of how beautiful it's going to look. Renderings. So most of these are based on real archival photographs, and some of them have also been reimagined by the artist Stan Douglas. So you'll know that this is done by the visual artist Stan Douglas and the screenwriter-director Chris Haddock. Some of you might have seen his work, Boulevard or Da Vinci's Inquest, or on National Geographic and MTV, there was a beautiful program called For Real, which was about centuries. Haddock has this interest actually in social justice, and I think it shows up in this work as well too. This is the back of the beer garden in Hogan's Alley that one of the characters runs. So in our production, we'll see a chair like that. It'll be a blue box. The actor will sit down on it, but it'll look like that. So the actors are actually working behind, almost like the gauze you have, your shears and your curtain in your house. You know how like if your lights are off indoors, nobody can see in, but if you turn your indoor lights on, everybody can see through your gauze. So this is what the scrim is like in front of the stage. And behind the stage, everything is blue, this color. And there's a couple of blue boxes that become chairs or tables. Anything that the actor touches or sits on is real, but every other environment is created by these renderings. and they all have to be matched up to where the chair is, to where the action is, exactly by the inch. So no getting casual. Like, you have to be exact. So it's very demanding physicality for the actors. This is how something might look on the inside. Again, we get this natural street lighting. I'm going to show something. So this is a mysterious electro treatment room. Now we're getting inside of the old Vancouver Hotel. So you can see how we start to set up the film noir feeling of the presentation. Now, something else that's really interesting is that the scrim will be here. That's the see-through gauze. This will be a blue room, and then behind us is so the wall will be blue and the floor will be blue, and the blue works to hold the image. Now, what's interesting is that we'll also, of course, have to light the stage, so all of our lighting has to match the images of where the light sources are coming from in this. So we can't throw a shadow in the opposite direction because we'll take you out of the place. So it's so interesting being able to manage light sources and scale, and that's not my job. Oh.
Thank God for that.
Right, hey? And it'll all be in black and white. So some of these renderings you see are in color, but they've now made the choice to present it all in black and white.
So all these images are going to be in the play?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's like
Well, these are the experimental ones. These were as they were working on it. I don't know which ones they've chosen for the production, but I do know that for the last 10 days, they've been in the Banff Centre for the Arts in Alberta, and they've been working on what works most powerfully, what tells the story best, how does it all work. So I'm just going to keep my way through here. And this is an interesting thing. As you see, it's a camera. So the Arts Club's been involved in this production for the last 3 years. We've been working on it. But there's been a team of people that Dan Douglas has been working with previous to that, including Emily Carr, which has been one of our cultural partners for our 50th season anniversary. Some of you did anybody do the Arts Club stroll? Okay, so that was what we did with Emily Carr too. So there's a gadget right here. It's a gear. And this was invented in the 3D studio at Emily Carr. Might sound insignificant, but the whole process of the magic of animation and 3D and how the cameras are going to work as our eyeballs for us in the cinematic way, this was a brand new technology that was devised at Emily Carr through Stan Douglas's research process. So, when you guys see the production, you'll just say, oh, it looks like a movie. That's neat. And this is a movie that's not playing right now. But so just to give you a quick outline of how that technology is going to work, you get a blue box, you get an actor and a light. You get a couple of cameras. Those cameras will be operated by the actors when they're not in the scene. Oh, so this is all blue, and then in front there's some cameras on trolleys. It's super high tech. And now these cameras feed into the computers, which then give out a live feed, goes back into another computer, and this mixing board, fantastic image, and then that mixing board sends it out into another projector, so it's this loop, the circuitry, and then you get the actor in the scene. Wild, hey? So what you'll see is actor right here, and then you'll see the huge Stanley stage. You might just see a close-up on my face doing something like, of course, this lip tremble won't translate to the back of the room, but when my face is, not my face, but somebody's face is 30 feet tall, you'll see it. So it's been a really interesting opportunity for the actors to practice the differences between like acting for the stage and acting for film. And that's what we got for you. So, I'm going to exit that, I guess. We'll leave that there for the moment. That's a snapshot of what we're working on with Helen Lawrence, and it's my great pleasure to now introduce the noir section, and you'll see how this all sort of feeds in, because my hope is that we're just enriching our Vancouver culture as we do this piece. So there's such a beautiful movement around writing and the history of this period, and we've got 3 fine writers with us this evening who are together collected in a new collection of work that's called Vancouver Confidential, and that's being published by one of our supreme presses in the city, Anvil Press. strong like Anvil. And the three of these authors, Katherine Rose, Aaron Chapman, and Diane Purvey, will be in this new collection. I don't have a cover to show you for that. However, you'll see it when it comes out. There's an illustration of it over there. So our first speaker this evening, am I starting with Kat? Yeah. Our first speaker this evening, or reader rather, is Katherine Rose. And I'm hoping that she is a real crime analyst. Real crime analyst, as well as a crime writer. And she has been a crime analyst with the Vancouver Police Department, and she's a researcher and a guide for the Vancouver Police Museum's Sins of the City tour. So as I mentioned, a lot of Helen Lawrence, there's a lot of crime and intrigue, and so we thought it would be a wonderful way to marry our cultural community's interests and present them both for you this evening. And what's also exciting about Katherine Rose is that she has a degree in history and forensic anthropology from SFU and the University of Western Ontario. So it's a real pleasure to have her with us this evening. And could you please make a warm welcome for Katherine Rose? And I will invite Diane Purvey and Aaron Chapman to the stage as well too. And they will all have their individual introductions when their reading starts.
Talk show.
Yeah.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. As Vanessa said, I'm really only a part-time historian. I actually moonlight as a criminal intelligence analyst with the Vancouver Police Department. But I like to consider myself a historian first and foremost because that is what my academic background is in. Since about 2008, I've also been involved with the Vancouver Police Museum, working, as Vanessa mentioned, as a researcher and tour guide for our Sins of the City walking tours that we run every summer. I don't know if any of you have been on the tour, but we sort of overhauled it last year, and so we now go through the Chinatown area, and we'll be starting that up again in the spring. Usually May long weekend is when we get that going again for the summer season. And it's through my work with the Police Museum that I sort of got interested in Vancouver history. That was never actually my focus when I was in university. But since that time, I've actually ended up doing far more local history research in an informal sense, really, than I ever did when I was in school. And so it's really great to sort of be a part of this project and have the chance to speak tonight because there is so much overlap between what I do these days with the Police Museum and with the Helen Lawrence production. The three of us that are here tonight are contributors to a book that will be coming out later this year called Vancouver Confidential, and every author involved, there's about a dozen of us, I guess, 15 maybe. Every one of us is writing on something different, but it's really been startling how much overlap there's been. And there's three of us actually contributing to the book that are going to be talking about the sort of unholy trinity, I like to call it, that I'll be discussing in my talk tonight. When Gerald Grant McGeer coasted to victory over the incumbent mayor, L.D. Taylor, in the 1935 civic election, he did so on a law and order mandate that immediately set out to investigate allegations of corruption at the highest levels of City Hall and the VPD. The election campaign wasn't the first time these two men had squared off. Allegations of corruption had actually gone back at least as far as 1910, rather coincidentally, LD's first year as mayor. But really, that had sort of been the mood of City Hall and the police department right from the city's beginnings in 1886. In 1928, however, all of these allegations kind of came to a head in the form of a massive public inquiry known as the Lenny Commission. The commission focused on widespread police corruption, and specifically L.D. Taylor's cozy relationship with two of the city's most notorious gangsters. Joe Salona was known at different times in the press as King of the Bawdy Houses, King of the Bootleggers, Public Enemy #1, and my personal favorite, the Mayor of East Hastings. Naturally, he was not actually the mayor, that was L.D. Taylor, but it was really hard to tell at times. Shu Moi, his Chinese counterpart, was the alleged king of the gamblers. The Lenny Commission, this is where things get interesting, the Lenny Commission had been headed by none other than Jerry McGeer, who was a King's Counsel, MLA, and future MP. And here's a picture of Jerry McGeer at work after winning the election. This is him in 1936. Here's a picture of L.D. Taylor at work, 1926. He's not the one with the baseball bat, that would be Babe Ruth. L.D. Taylor is catching for him, and that would be the chief of police acting as ump in behind. So it sort of gives you a really good feel for what the sort of feeling was like at City Hall and in the head office of the VPD. In the end, the Lenny Commission was never able to conclusively find evidence of any sort of a scandal or corruption, but it did end up costing LD the next election. Fortunately for him, the people of Vancouver had really short memories, and he was back in office for a fourth and final time in 1930, despite the rampant gambling, prostitution, drug use, and bootlegging that pervaded the downtown core. None of which, of course, I think it's safe to say are things that have ever really bothered the city or any mayor that we've had. All of these things were products of what was known as LD's open town policy. And far from hurting LD's reputation in the city, these businesses were actually the secret to LD's popularity. They tended to flourish in the working class East End, now known as Strathcona, but it was the East End for a good 100 years. And their role there was that they allowed this very working class community to make a little bit of extra dough in the beer gardens and the bootlegging operations and the brothels that were sort of running out their back doors. Since the Conservative vote was often split at election time, LD ended up being elected as mayor. He won 7 elections for a total of 11 years in office, making him not only the city's most corrupt mayor by a long shot, but also its longest running even to this day. It's not really surprising, I guess, that LD's terms in office were always dogged with controversy. He had actually arrived in Vancouver in the early 1900s after fleeing fraud charges in the US, which is something that he successfully managed to keep secret throughout his entire time in Vancouver, right up until he died. So once L.D. Taylor found himself ensconced back in the mayor's office in 1930, the debauchery more or less continued unabated throughout the toughest years of the Depression. Unfortunately, he had an added problem to contend with this time, as thousands of unemployed men flooded into the city from across Canada looking for work and housing and social assistance. By 1934, the city had more or less descended into chaos, with protests and riots seemingly every other week, and petty crime through the roof. Part of the problem here, in addition to LD and his relaxed attitude, shall we say, towards crime, was a lack of continuity at the head of the police department. The VPD had actually become known as the graveyard of police chiefs after going through 6 of them in less than 10 years. In 1933, after Chief Bingham had been sacked, a guy called John Cameron was brought in to head the department. He was the New West chief of police at the time, but he'd also had a distinguished career as a constable with the Vancouver Police Department. The election and the subsequent police shakeup that followed in 1935 was a personal vendetta for Jerry McGeer. Having failed to convince the Lenny Commission of any outright bribery, it was really a point of pride for him to sort of show how crime had continued to infest the city and how he was the man to root it out. McGeer was energetic and deeply religious, an incredible public speaker by all accounts, and he really stood in sharp contrast to the aging LD, who had been known to drink in the booze cans of Hogan's Alley. McGeer won the election with 80% of the popular vote, and his victory evidently worried the powers that be in the police department, because by the time election results were announced, the department already had Joe Salona in its crosshairs. Just 2 days after the election, Joe Salona was arrested in his brothel on the 4th floor of the Maple Hotel. Here's John Cameron in 1934. Here's his replacement, Constable Foster. And here's Joe Salona, circa 1920. The reason we have a picture of Joe Salona from 1920 is that he managed to avoid ever getting his picture in the newspapers until he was implicated during the Mulligan Affair in the 1950s. So Salona was released on $30,000 bail, which was a lot of money at the time, I'm sure you can appreciate. But he didn't remain free for long. Things really went downhill from there. On December 30th, a drunk and despondent Chief Cameron allegedly turned up on McGeer's doorstep, begging to be allowed to keep his job. But it did no good. And he submitted his resignation on New Year's Eve, stating in his resignation letter that, in view of the announced statement of Mayor-elect McGeer that he proposes to institute a drastic plan of police reform, I feel that my continuance as Chief of Police might prevent the fruition of this undertaking. And as mentioned, he was replaced by Colonel W.W. Foster just 2 or 3 days later. Cameron was not the only casualty of the new regime. Acceptance of the chief's resignation was the final act of 2 other members of the police commission, police magistrates J.A. Findley and W.M. McKay, both of whom would also soon be investigated. Deputy Chief John Murdoch didn't fare much better, reigning as acting chief for just 3 short days before also being suspended, pending further investigation. 16 other officers joined John Cameron and Deputy Murdoch on the department's blacklist, ranging in rank from detective to inspector and comprising the majority of the department's elite criminal investigation department. In justifying the department purges, McGeer alleged that the demoralization of the police force and the open commercialization of crime resulted from a general laxity in law enforcement, ineffective police administration, incapable and slack prosecution of arrested offenders, feeble police court administration, and a general attitude that the police commission and magistrates courts, working in cooperation with dishonest police officers, had the right to license crime. Ouch. This was a quote from a very public report. The new chief submitted his own report on January 22nd, recommending dismissal of 12 of the suspended officers, and also indicated that criminal charges were imminent. According to Foster, every officer that he had interviewed, including those under suspension, declared that vice conditions in Vancouver were disgraceful. More significantly, there was a general consensus that conditions had steadily been worsening over the past several years, and it was LD Taylor's open town policy that was to blame. It was reported that persistent interference prevented officers of all ranks from doing their jobs, and that it was common knowledge that any officers who tried to get in the way of the crime bosses were moved to outlying stations in short order. Certain criminal characters also feature prominently in this report, most notably Joe Salona and Shu Moy. And the rest of Foster's list of infamy reads like a noir-era crime novel. Names like Mickey Tudor and Shorty Miller kept company with Newsy Bernard and one gentleman known only as Tom the Greek. These men had the run of the town and of the police department, commanding immediate audiences with the chief of police through means of a secret knock on his office door. And it also came out that on at least one occasion, Chief Cameron and Deputy Murdoch had spent the night cruising Howe Sound on the police boat in company of Joe Salona, fellow pimp Tony Lombardo, certain women of the underworld, and a bagpiper from the VPD pipe band who had allegedly been brought along to provide entertainment. Somewhat suspiciously, the captain of the police boat had been recommended by Cameron for promotion the previous fall. Foster's report alleged that Shu Moy had had occasional use of the chief's car, but also that in August of 1934, Moy had paid the $150 wages of some farmhands at the chief's ranch in Haney. Moy wasn't the only beneficiary of Cameron's weak moral compass. Cameron also had a tight relationship with 3 other notorious East End bootleggers. Joe Alvaro allegedly frequently lent a truck to Cameron for trips out to his ranch. Wally Cole ran a gin joint on Kingsway where Cameron would spend entire evenings drinking with brown-nosing beat cops bent on promotion. And Eugene Valenti, whose taxi company was always on call to deliver champagne and whiskey to the chief's office for illicit on-duty drinking parties. Administrative corruption abounded, fraud, theft, sloppy record-keeping. In what was called an appalling lack of cooperation between the police and local law enforcement departments, no records were kept by the police court clerks as to whether fines had actually been paid or convicted offenders imprisoned. Foster's report was the final nail in John Cameron's coffin. On February 19, 1935, arrest warrants were issued for the ex-chief and his 5 accomplices, Salona, Moy, Alvaro, Valenti, and Cole. Cameron and Salona were easy enough to find, but Moy, showing his insight, had fled to China just days before McGeer officially took office. Salona, who still had not stood trial on the prostitution charges from December, added another $10,000 bail to the $30,000 he had already posted. Salona actually spent a lot of time in court in the first half of 1935, first for the December charge of living off the avails of prostitution, followed by a second trial in March for a related charge of procuring the 2 young girls involved. These were followed by the requisite appeals, and finally, he finished up his time in court with the conspiracy trial with co-accused John Cameron and their other accomplices. Salona didn't make a lot of friends on the stand. He called the lead prosecutor cheeky and denied every accusation leveled at him. And although he admitted to having once been on the police boat, he claimed that he was helping the police search for a wanted criminal and denied the presence of any women, liquor, or bagpipers. He cited McGeer's attack on his reputation during the Lenny Commission as the reason for his many aliases. He did not explain how he planned to sneak up on a wanted criminal with the wailing of bagpipes wafting across the waves of Howe Sound. The prostitution cases were a little more sensational in content, a little more titillating. But the corruption trial was the far bigger event. 70 witnesses were called to testify in the preliminary hearing. And the most convincing evidence of all actually came from the police witnesses who testified that they had been told by Cameron to go easy on certain establishments, including 2 hotels linked to Salona's later prostitution charges. This is the one from December, the Maple Hotel, still there. That's it in the 1930s and today, from the amazing blog, Changing Vancouver. Cameron's Ranch was apparently also a frequent weekend getaway for crime bosses and underage girls. And beat constables working the East End claimed that the gambling dens run by Shuey Moy always seemed to be closed on days that police raids were planned. We don't have a picture of Shuey Moy. I've never been able to find one, but this is one of his many, many gambling dens located at 91 East Pender Street, and one of the few original buildings in Vancouver that's actually still standing.
Is that Pender and Abbott?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So fairly...
Columbia, that's right. Columbia,
yes,
yeah.
You're right, it is Columbia. Fairly quickly, a picture emerged of a chief of police and a good portion of the department as well, beset by alcoholism and financial difficulties, freely flaunting their power at the expense of those officers with professional integrity, and at huge cost to the community at large. And I should sort of take some time to really point out here that this corruption was ultimately found to be really concentrated at the upper levels. There were a large number of beat cops who really did try to do a good job and wanted to help make the city a better place. But the 4 officers that were initially suspended, but were not ultimately terminated, the reason they were granted a reprieve was because Chief Foster recognized that as very junior constables, they were actually just victims of a fairly vicious system. Officers testified to having seen known criminals drinking in the offices of the chief and the morality squad, and having been given money by the chief for satisfactory performance after keeping him company at all-night parties in Wally Cole's bar. Cameron was ultimately ordered to stand trial in a higher court, but much as had been the case with Chief Long before him during the Lenny Commission, he emerged triumphant. The judge noted that while several instances of moral delinquency had been at issue, none of them, in and of themselves, proved any overt agreement among the three accused. Joe Salona was ultimately sentenced to 22 years in prison for the prostitution charges and for keeping a gambling den in the Maple Hotel. His sentence was cut in half on appeal. He was released on good behavior after only 6 years. And there was actually such a public outcry when Joe Salona was released that the parole board actually revoked their decision and sent him back to Ocala to finish off his sentence. It probably didn't help that he was an Italian citizen, and this was 1941. Shu Moy remained in China throughout the duration of the trial and never was convicted of any criminal offense. So if there had been a shadow of a doubt in anyone's mind at the end of 1934 as to the complicity of L.D. Taylor in all of this, that doubt should have been pretty thoroughly extinguished by the summer of 1935. The strongest evidence in L.D.'s favor is that he retired from politics in apparent poverty, although this isn't necessarily all that surprising given his disastrous record of fiscal mismanagement at the civic level. And yet, a few days after his final political loss in the 1937 election, the noted East End defense lawyer, Angelo Branca, who had defended Joe Salona in 1935, sent LD a letter informing him that a group of anonymous well-wishers had established a pension for him of $25 per week for life. Dirty 30s indeed.
I'd like to take one or two questions after each speaker, and then if we've got time at the end, we'll do some more. So if anybody has a question or comment, we'd love to hear from you. Yes, sir.
Vancouver was a lot smaller in 1935. It was smaller yet in 1929 because it didn't include Point Grey and it didn't include South Vancouver. I'm wondering if South Vancouver and Point Grey had the same problem with their police departments pre-merger.
Not that I know of, no. I think part of it was that South Vancouver was a little more rural in nature. Point Grey was sort of a little more well-heeled. I think a lot of the corruption really came out of, like today, the East End in 1935 and the 1920s. Prior to that, really was where a lot of the vice and sort of these illicit industries were concentrated. So there maybe wasn't quite the same opportunity or the need for bribery in the more outlying areas. And I think it's really telling that a lot of officers, if they tried to interfere and do the right thing and shut down these brothels and these gambling dens, they would be moved to South Vancouver, which really tells us something about how many opportunities for corruption or how many crime bosses were really operating out there. It was seen as an area where an honest police officer couldn't do too much damage.
So I'm going to move on to our next speaker, and then we'll do some more questions at the end. Thank you. Katherine Rose. So you should know that the story of Helen Lawrence is an imaginary story, but it's based very much on the real history of Vancouver, and it's been adapted for creative purposes. Now, speaking of Vice, this is some downtown Vice. How beautiful a cover is that? Isn't that wonderful? This is the work of the one Aaron Chapman, this gentleman right here. Would you like to take your place at the podium?
Sure.
So this is Aaron's last publication. You might know some of his work. He's a journalist, a music journalist?
No, I don't do much music journalism, actually, just mostly history journalism, actually. A little bit of political writing and other things as well. So don't write much music stuff, though. I play it.
That's the link. I left my notes at home. So I knew there was music in there. So, but Aaron has done a really fantastic collection around the history of the Penthouse, and I was able to be at that launch when it happened last year.
Oh, okay.
And that was the second time I went to the Penthouse. Anybody else been there?
You can admit to it, it's okay.
All right. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll have Aaron Chapman tell you about his work for Liquor, Lust, and the Law. And I ask you to make a warm welcome for Aaron Chapman.
Thank you very much. Well, I find myself at a bit of somewhat of a loss here because I'm sort of here in connection with a play I haven't seen, also regarding a book that I have yet to finish with Vancouver Confidential and whatnot. So we're sort of traveling sort of a little bit blind here and whatnot. But
We're thematic.
yeah, exactly. So suffice it to say, my interest in Vancouver history certainly comes from being born and raised here to a certain extent. I'm 41 years old, and I remember certainly what Vancouver used to look like before Expo. If you tell anybody who's perhaps under 25 today, there used to be log booms in Falls Creek, they wouldn't believe you until you showed them the photos. But I think it's something that developed in me. I didn't necessarily have an interest in history when I was young, or in my teens or anything like that. It sort of developed, I think, after I sort of went into adult years and whatnot, and began to see some of the changes in the city, because certainly the city's changed a lot since Expo, but I think it's even changed more so in the last 10, 15 years. And we've done a very good job of bringing in the new, but we haven't necessarily done a great job of keeping the old. I know people who are my age that talk like 80-year-old men and used to say, I remember seeing a band called DOA down the block there at Richards on Richards years ago. And I remember, there's very few places that are cross-cultural places in Vancouver where, let's say, your grandfather might have been to, and your father might have been to, and you could go to, because we've gotten rid of some of those places. So the Penthouse certainly is one of those places, and it's there's very few of those around. Perhaps the Orpheum is one, and the Commodore maybe being another. But I'm going to save actually for some of the talk that I would do about the Penthouse nightclub for a talk that actually Lanny and I, over in the corner, the author of Vancouver's Awesome, are going to do on April 29th? Something like that. It's April 29th. Here, probably in the same space, where we're both going to sort of presenting books. But I will talk to you about Vancouver Confidential chapter that I'm doing, which is essentially about what Vancouver was like in the Second World War. We have very little residue of what the city was like at that time. Perhaps the one thing that sort of captured my imagination was out at Tower Beach, out by Wreck Beach on the western sort of edge of the city there. There are two gun towers, these concrete bunkers that were built there for an enemy that never came. And that idea became interesting to me, and it's one of the few sort of markers in the city that we'd have left. There's a lot of people that would find it hard to imagine what Vancouver would have been like in the Second World War. Of course, I wasn't there to see it, but to find out that there was rationing, that there was blackouts, and there was really a certain sense of fear over the city that the city I don't think has seen before or since. As someone who grew up in the 70s, I certainly remember the final decade or so of the Cold War, where if you were home watching cartoons when I was a kid, suddenly on television there would be a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test. In the event of a real emergency, you'd be notified such and such. And the tone would play. By the early 80s, there were TV shows like Threads and The Day After depicting a nuclear attack. And I grew up absolutely certain that I would be probably the last generation on the planet because it was so drilled into us that we would experience a nuclear attack. I think even if somebody who had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was not that sense. It was a frontier then. But by that point in the early 80s, I certainly remember being a teenager and thinking that probably I didn't think I would live past 30, and I don't think necessarily I was overly scared or a Chicken Little syndrome or anything like that. But the images and the political themes that are of the time certainly suggested that we were sort of careening to that eventually, or if not, there would be a third world war. There'd be some sort of attack. Maybe we'll still see one. Maybe terrorism is that now that we don't have that. Nevertheless, the idea that fear was something that would control the city for a certain amount of time became interesting to me. And I'll read one little portion actually of my chapter in Vancouver Confidential, just pertaining to the blackouts. So just to sort of imagine a little bit how much the city was different back then. I don't have any photos to show, but I'm going to try and make up for it at the end here. A little bit with something different for you. While many might consider blackouts and rationing were the only circumstances that plagued wartime Britain, were circumstances that only plagued wartime Britain during the German Blitz. Vancouverites today might be surprised to learn that they were present during the war, in the city during the war years as well. On May 22nd, 1941, at 10 o'clock in the evening, with 5 short blasts, repeated 3 times on the city's air raid sirens that had been installed back in 1939, the Lower Mainland experienced its first significant wartime blackout. Lights in homes and storefronts were turned off, blackout curtains pulled across windows, with street lamps and traffic lights turning off across various districts in the city that were described in the newspapers, like a man wandering from room to room, dousing the lights of his home for the night. Beyond Vancouver, the blackout tests include the North Shore, Burnaby, New Westminster and Delta, as well as Victoria, Oak Bay and Saanich on Vancouver Island, covering some 600 square miles of territory in British Columbia and affecting some 400,000 residents. Military brass such as Major General R.L. Alexander, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Air Command, Group Captain C.R. Sleman, Commanding Officer of the Western Air Command, and Commodore W.J.R. Beach, the Senior Naval Officer in the Pacific Canadian Forces, were represented along with members of BC Provincial Police who were on hand to comment on the success of the blackout test that ran just 15 minutes. Vancouver Police Headquarters and the Fire Department reported there were no calls or alarms during the blackout period. Coverage even reached the Ottawa Citizen that reported Vancouver lay as black as a country village after midnight. With war in Europe, the blackout may have seemed like a curiosity or even a novelty to some citizens in early 1941, but when the Pacific War opened and the war years progressed, regular blackouts, air raid tests, and further civil defense measures contributed to the overall sense of fear that an attack on BC shores was imminent. Vancouver motorists were warned to cover their car lights with only a slit open or paint their headlights blue to reduce the light. And while the first blackout may have been only a 15-minute test with some warning, in the coming months air raid blackouts lasting as long as up to 3 hours became quite commonplace. Those who did not comply with the precautionary air raid blackouts were subject to fines by roaming auxiliary police who used to check neighborhoods for blackout compliance, as well as ARP teams that watched those in their own community. 4 Vancouver citizens who kept their lights on during a surprise blackout on September 28, 1942, were fined with their names and addresses printed, as was customary of the period, in the pages of the newspaper that covered the daily police blotter. C.A. Jordan, a proprietor of an antique shop at 1015 Robson Street, was fined $25 with the alternative of a month in jail after he left a light on near the rear residential part of his store while he was in it, as was Frank Dahl at the Balmoral Hotel, who continued to display a light on his room during the blackout. The accident of leaving your lights on while you were out during a blackout saw no compassion. Police forced their way through the back door to Mr. R.L. Walker's home at 1927 West 3rd, while he and his wife were out of the house, and fined $5 or 5 days in jail for the infraction. Another, Mrs. G. Martin of 1740 Victoria Drive, complained to the magistrate she rushed home as soon as she could after the blackout was announced and turned off the offending light, a 15-watt bulb she'd left on because she was afraid to enter the house in the dark. She was given $5 or 10 days in jail. Tourists in Vancouver during the war years were not exempt from blackout rules either. Behind the bureau of every room in the Georgia Hotel, guests were provided a heavy sheet of black paper marked blackout material. And during the glass top, and under the glass top of the room's dresser lay instructions on how to tack up the paper to the glass window pane, warning hotel guests to use just a single weak light in the event of an air raid siren being heard. If a 5-minute steady tone on the 2-tone siren was heard, the quote-unquote imminent danger signal, guests were instructed to take the stairs down to the hotel basement, where an air raid shelter had been devised. While the hotel would sound their own fire alarm bells, the Vancouver Sun noted that the city air raid sirens would be hard to miss, as they were huge, throaty, and in many in number, and spread out across the city and tested at odd hours, giving pause to hurrying Vancouverites at high noon or dusk. I often hear from people who sometimes say that Vancouver doesn't have a history. The city's too young. Of course, if you go to some place like Boston, you walk down the street and you'll see a building that says built in 1616 or something like that. Our history is different. In fact, I think the history that we're subject to is something very unique here. We sort of see it change before our very eyes. Nevertheless, there's lots of opportunity, and there's lots of sort of stories, particularly noir stories, in Vancouver. As I mentioned, I don't have any photos to show anything like that, but as mentioned, in my previous or perhaps other occupation, I have worked as a musician. So I think I'll do a song for you,
Great.
if you don't mind. Now we have to imagine the Alice McKay room being a little bit of a, we're going to turn to sort of
A den of
nightclub
inequity?
here, if we can. And I'll see if I can.
Oh, Shall I take the lights
You
out?
could do that if you like, yeah. There we go. One of the, there we go. A little bit of, well, we got something there anyway. It's not, we need some cigarette smoke and maybe police drinking after hours here or something. There we go, that's nice. Oh, very good. I wish I had a photo to show you here as well. There's a fascinating story. If you walk by Broadway, up where the old Beaumac car lot used to be, that neon sign is still there. It's covered up by that sort of ugly Toys R Us sign. And I remember as a kid hearing a story about a guy that got up on top of the sign and he poisoned his wife while he was, you can if you like, yeah, sure. This sort of strange murder mystery story. It sort of captured my attention, maybe about 10 years ago. And it became sort of the first song that I written for an album that I'm going to see if I can finish this year, that sort of details Vancouver crime history in a sort of a jazz noir feel, sort of at least thematically and lyrically speaking and whatnot. The story is a true story. It's sort of hard to believe. It almost feels like something out of Double Indemnity, and you have to feel, perhaps as you hear it, you can hear Fred McMurray being cast in the major role or whatever. But I'll read the. I don't have the band with me tonight. Usually I got a few fellas with me on drums and horns and guitars and whatnot to play this out. But I'll do it sort of solo. But this is the audio track. I took my vocals from the recording, so I'm going to do those live. But I'll do the music party with the band that here with me. So
You play the music and then I'll put the image up so you can see.
Okay. I think is that it here? Let's see if we can do this here. Or is that it? Oh, there we go. There we go. Gotta think ambience. Vancouver Broadway, 1965. The summer heat slithered and crept and the asphalt was breaking a fever of 102. Coupe de Villes and Buicks are swimming up and down the dark street at night, floating like manta rays under the warm amber of a traffic light. And down at the cave, there's a playbill for Mitzi Gaynor coming soon. And man, that girl has legs from here to who hit the broom. And out on Kingsway, as street cleaners mopping up the street. While inside the E&B Steakhouse, the guy's mopping up the gravy from his plate with a slice of Wonder Bread so white you could clean a piano with it. Others are at home falling asleep. Sleep in the glow of the Indian TV test pattern. Sleep in front of their Curtis Mathis or Zenith Electrohomes. Broadway's lit too. Broadway's bathed in red and blue. Ruby and sapphire neon tubes glowing 10 stories high from the Beaumac sign. Glowing and buzzing and flickering into the 60-cycle hum. Standing tall at the front of the Beaumac car lot every night, pouring neon light and reflecting off all the chrome in the lot. And maybe that neon sign sizzled a bit more in that 1965 summer. Rene Castellani was his name. Rene Castellani. A radio man from CKNW who got up on top of the sign and vowed to stay on top until all the cars were sold in the lot. Folks, I'm going to stay up here till Beaumac sells every car it's got. So come on down here and get me off this sign. Come on down and see a new Fleetwood Eldorado hardtop, 4 white heat, 4 white feet, music and heat, wheel skirts and opera lights with a comfort tilt steering wheel, with a walnut trim, and a V8 engine that purrs like a hymn. You can drive one off the lot today, so come on down to Beaumac on Broadway. You could drive down Broadway that summer and see Castellani making friends with the Seagulls, and tune into AM 98 and listen to old Rene with traffic and news on the hour. All the while, that neon sign would be glowing down on every car there. Each 2 tons of iron made back when Detroit used to care. And not even the 2-piece suit car salesmen in their Ingledew shoes that shine like mirrors knew that in the dark of the night Castellani would climb down, sneak away for an hour or two. Nobody except the boys back at the radio station he'd innocently ask if they'd fill it and play a record at the top of the hour and cover his ass. And when he'd sneak away, he'd come home to find his plump wife Esther and their hair in rollers, eating bonbons in bed, chain-smoking Winstons. But on other nights, his friends would notice his company car outside the house of Miss Miller, the station's strawberry blonde switchboard operator. And while he sat there day and night on top of the Beaumac sign, playing commercials for Honest Nat's Department Store and Woodward's $1.49 Day, As he daydreamed out on the horizon, maybe it's easy to imagine the choice in his mind. The suburbs, his wife, and leftovers. And in marriage, he knew the honeymoon was over. We're over to Miss Miller's around 9 with a smile on her face and a bottle of wine. So he started to sneak down from each night and bring home to Esther a milkshake, her favorite treat. She never bothered to ask why her husband was being so sweet. Slowly, Esther started to get sick, but never suspected her doting husband of any trick. And the lonely late-night coffee patrons of the Night and Day Diner would never notice him and never notice his halfway grin, reflecting off the Arborite counter as he came in. He came in to get another milkshake to go. And Esther got sick. Esther got worse and worse until one day they called in a hearse. That night Esther died, one of the boys from the station came by to see if Renee was okay. Renee wasn't in tears. He had his feet up on the couch, having a beer, eating a Stouffer's TV turkey dinner, laughing at some comic on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, Esther might have died without another word. Some said Renee never seemed to grieve. Others said he never wore his heart on his sleeve. The neighbors began to talk over fences and coffee shops, and the coroner's hunches went to suspicions, and suspicions became questions. Like why 2 days after Esther was in the ground, he'd taken off with Miss Miller to Reno on vacation. And when the police found the half-empty bottle of weed-killer arsenic under Castellani's sink, and everybody knew Renee was never a gardener, never gave a damn about weeds. Renee must have felt doomed when the coroner opened Esther's tomb, and when arsenic in the body was tested, and he was arrested for murder. Newspapers flashed his name and called him the milkshake murderer. Renee, with his head held high in the stand, said through it all he was an innocent man. When the judgment came down, they found him guilty and hit him with a life sentence. He did his time and rarely talked of the crime, and no one came to visit him in jail. The station scraped his name off the office door, and soon no one cared anymore, and even Miss Miller married someone else and turned tail. As he sat out his years in that cell, maybe Renee Castellani thought until he died in '82. Maybe crime doesn't pay as good as it used to. Now, if you go up to Broadway today, the car lot is gone. There are no more Coupe de Villes or Buicks driving by. No more radio waves pulsing from there. Big kid stores moved in. The only cars they're selling are toys. The Bomac sign is half covered up, but it still stands tall there, right where Renee Castellani stayed in that summer of 1965. A freestanding memory with not a volt running through it. But where Renee dreamt of Miss Miller, dreamt up a plan, where it all began, fueled by blood red and sapphire blue neon, buzzing into a Vancouver night. Thank you.
Wow. Is that a true story?
It is a true story, yes. I ended up talking to some of the retired employees at CKNW who remembered Renee quite well, and I think his daughter is still around. I didn't want to give her a call.
Esther's child?
Esther's child is, yeah, they have a daughter. I think the Castellani home for a while was on one of the Secrets of the City tours where the bus would drive by. Probably the people who live in there now have no idea what happened back then. But and there was an ad exec named Tony Antonius at CKNW. I'm not sure if he's still alive. It's been a couple of years since I've talked to him. It's quite getting on. And he was actually the guy that he was a copy editor, worked at his typewriter all the time. So when the page, and he would, usually the guy that was assigned to sort of think up jingles, when he would get to the end of the page, of course the bell on the typewriter would go off. And that's how he came up with the $1.49 day. $1.49 day to Woodward's. And that's where he told me he got the idea for that. But he knew Renee and said, he was a really nice guy. And when he got out of jail, he helped him get a job in a radio station up in Vancouver Island. And he never talked about it except one time where he said, if people knew the whole story and knew the whole truth, what that hall was, you know, people would think differently about it, but he never.
Was he a
never told
BC
us.
Penn?
He was, yes.
Question?
And he was sentenced to death initially, but that was just when Canada changed the death penalty, so he just did his life sentence instead. So anyway, not in Vancouver Confidential, but something else. But
So
the
we-
World War II story will be. So
We will have some time for questions at the end, but let's take one from the floor now. Question or comment, please?
that's good.
No, did anybody visit BC Penn before it closed, or?
I never did any time there myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually decommissioned it. It was, that was back probably 1971 or something. And so, yeah, we went through there and it was quite something because the first Ramble was made there. And I signed the contract to let him use that for that. There was a scene there in the shower room.
Yeah.
Caused a lot of consternation. The federal government had taken it to
Prison warden? Or
No,
something?
I wasn't the prison warden. I was with Public Works. Public Works had taken custodianship of it.
Right.
And we were just turning it off, getting rid of it. So,
Wow.
anyway, so they
There we go.
tried to make some money out of it before they tore it down.
Wow. Wow, awesome. Anybody have? Okay. Well, that's so romantic, that last. I feel all swanky. Yeah, round of applause. Romantic, I don't know if that's what I meant.
I'll take slice.
Yeah, swanky. So, Diane is the Director of Arts at Kwantlen College, and it is a real pleasure to have her with us this evening as well, too. Diane Purvey and her partner John Belshaw have made this beautiful book. Ooh, Vancouver Noir. See, we have a whole movement here. Anvil Press and one Mr. John Belshaw happen to be at the table right there. So if this book isn't there for you to borrow from the beautiful public library, where you can do so at no cost, you can put down your hard-earned cash, baby, and buy a book. Take it home tonight. Okay, so Ms. Purvey, would you please share your story with us this evening? A round warm of welcome. Oh. I'll try, sure. Okay. And we're going to press F5. And then you just
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. Can you hear me okay? Are these mics good? Yeah, good.
We'll make it just so that you don't have to feel your back down.
Okay, thanks. And just a clarification, I'm the Dean of Arts at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and I just want to give a shout out to my partner in crime, John Belshaw, over there. John is actually the mastermind of Vancouver Confidential. He's the person who got us all together, and it's really because of him that we're all three up here tonight. So thanks to you, John, for I'm going to be talking about a murder as well, but a rather different one. And I actually have only 2 photos to show you, and I'm going to tease you and show them only at the end. I call this Woolridge Driven to Kill Wife, Lessons on How to Get Away with Murder. And it's really the murder that I'll be focusing on, plus some other violence that happened in the city in 1947. So I'll describe the murder to begin with. On the afternoon of Saturday, March 1st, 1947, Malcolm Woolridge, a 20-year-old ex-Navy veteran, husband and father, shot to death his wife of 3 years, Viola Woolridge, age 22, in a downtown Vancouver boarding house. His guilt was never disputed. After firing 3 bullets into her body at close range, he walked into a neighbor's room and called the police. Almost 4 months later, on June 28, 1947, Malcolm was found guilty of manslaughter by a 12-man jury. Minutes later, he walked away from court, a free man. It's fair to say that the Woolridge trial, which was closely followed by the public and staged in a packed courtroom, was about more than a marriage gone bad. How Vancouverites in the media and in the courtroom responded to the murder of Viola Woolridge sheds light on one of the darkest stories of the terminal city. I'll set the stage. It's 1947. After the stagnation of the 1930s and the disruptions of the Second World War, Vancouver was finally growing again. There was an economic boom that was shared with the rest of the post-war Western world. Things were looking up. However, it was also just the beginning of the Cold War. Recently, Soviet cipher clerk Igor Guzenko had only recently defected in Ottawa, setting off a widespread Red Scare and fear of Russian spy network. There was also a sense that the nation was fragile because of the Cold War, and women in particular. There was a discourse that we find if we looked in the newspapers or in the magazines, for example, that was directed towards women, indicating that because they had to be really careful in terms of keeping the family intact, because a fragile family led to a fragile nation. And so women were in particular told in some ways that they had to keep the family together. In the midst of this growth, there was a perceived crime wave. In fact, the year 1947 was near the peak of a rising homicide rate. A civic campaign to alleviate citizens' fears and restore law and order only served to keep it in the news. One of the things I did for this research was that I looked at a single newspaper, the Vancouver News Herald, for the entire year in 1947. And what really surprised me was the amount of violence that happened in the streets. I think today we look upon our city and think about it being violent, but in fact in 1947 there was much more violence in a random way. And I'm going to just give you a few snippets of what I found in the newspaper articles to give you a sense of this random everyday violence that occurred. As I said, reports of random and even erratic violence are splattered throughout the pages of the city's newspaper in 1947. For example, the front page of the February 4th edition headline proclaims, "Thug, slug, kidnap, vet." A former soldier was held up, robbed, slugged, and kidnapped in his own auto, and later thrown from the vehicle by a pair of armed and masked bandits. In March, under the title "Woman Thug," the newspaper details the strong-armed team of a man and a woman who robbed their victim of $30 at 2:30 a.m. Sunday in the 300 block Dunlevy. The victim said the man struck him on the jaw and held his arms while the woman searched his pockets. And in May, a married couple alleged they were victims of an unprovoked attack on an early Saturday evening. The husband told police he and his wife were en route to a Davie Street dance hall when the three men stepped from an auto and accosted them. This was a serious and vicious attack. The man was treated in the hospital for facial lacerations. In this case, violence was more than threatened, it was handed out. What's more, one didn't need to have a gang membership to be a victim of violence. Seemingly respectable couples were attacked, not just lone individuals caught in the wrong part of town. Who was behind these attacks? The newspapers literally used the term thugs to describe the perpetrators. Although their identity might never be revealed, the typical thug is male, usually white, and often identified as a veteran. There is an assumption of heterosexuality, although the attacks are sexual in nature. There is also a certain rootlessness about these criminals. Perhaps after returning from the war, they had not yet been able to find employment and have drifted into a life of random violent crime. Not only were daylight muggings commonplace in Vancouver, but there was a surprising amount of gunplay in the streets. For example, in February 1947, a 67-year-old woman who was waiting for a streetcar in downtown Vancouver was shot through the leg when one of two policemen chasing a suspect fired a warning shot. A second warning shot was discharged. Significantly, these warning shots were not fired into the air, but horizontally at the height of about 3 feet. This is what it says in the newspaper. Mrs. Annie Campbell is reported in good condition in hospital, suffering from a flesh wound where the bullet tore through her left leg above the knee and grazed the right leg. What was the suspect's crime? The two constables were running after the suspect from a cafe on Granville where he was reported to be begging. The suspect had asked the cashier for 7 cents while lounging near the cash register. The constables justified their volley of bullets by claiming that they had been led to believe the suspect had a gun, but no weapon was found. In April, there were 2 incidents of people at home who miraculously, this is again the newspaper, who miraculously escaped death from wild flying bullets. The first occurred in the West End living room of a mother and her young son. Death in the form of a rifle slug fired through their front room window nearly took the lives of at 8 p.m. of the victims as they sat side by side on the living room sofa in their small new home. The bullet missed the boy as he bent forward a split second before the missile pierced the mother's left cheek as she sat reading the paper. On the same evening, a policeman was sitting in his suite in downtown Vancouver when a bullet smashed through a window behind him, glanced off the back of the Chesterfield a foot from his head, and fell to the floor. Although the officer raced outside in search of a gunman, no suspect was found. So you get the sense then, I think, of this randomness, this violence that was happening in an everyday sense in the city. These incidents beg the question, where did the guns come from? The newspapers of the day don't give the issue much attention. Anecdotal reports tell us of veterans who brought unlicensed weapons home from war as souvenirs. Many veterans' homes and those of families in and from rural backgrounds were repositories of firearms. One impact of war was that society was more complacent about these weapons. In 1947, a 1947 newspaper piece on Vancouver Vital Statistics reports that, quote, firearms were responsible for 5 accidental deaths in November of last year compared with 2 during the same month of 1945. Firearms were available and they were being used, with some abandoned by both cops and robbers. Not all homicides involved guns, to be sure, but this was something that made the Woolridge case stand out. So I'm going to turn now to the Woolridge case. So that's Viola.
Oh.
She's obviously dead. So I'll give you a little, I'll tell you about how she died and then what happened in the trial. So Malcolm and Viola were married in 1943. They were married in Edmonton and it was a shotgun wedding. Malcolm was 17, Viola was 19. Malcolm, after the wedding, entered the Navy and was in the war. Right from the get-go, there were marital problems. I don't think we would ever want to describe their marriage as a happy one. Nevertheless, they had a child. Viola obviously got pregnant soon after the wedding, or before the wedding, and they had a child soon after. Their son, whose name was Butch, often stayed with the in-laws or with somebody from the Children's Aid Society called Mrs. Wells, who would look after their son. The day before the murder was their 3rd anniversary, and they planned to meet in their apartment downtown at 10:30 p.m. Viola, however, didn't come home until 5:30 in the morning. When she returned, they had an argument. Malcolm slapped her. She left the apartment. She came back. He got a gun. He shot her 3 times. Once right through her chest, one lodged in her heart, and one grazed her head. He walked into the neighbor's apartment and called the Vancouver Police Department. So as I said, his guilt was never contested. He confessed to the crime. The trial coverage, however, was really interesting, and this is where I really think we need to focus, because it tells us a lot of society at that time. And here's a picture of Malcolm. Malcolm is described as frail, small, slight, a trembling youth. He is mild-mannered, pale, haggard, and nervous. He's commonly referred to as a boy by the judge, and it's Justice Manson who was the trial judge. Viola, on the other hand, is described as muscular, stocky, heavy, well-developed, and well-nourished. She is an untidy and resentful housewife, and dirty. Viola is nagging and quarrelsome, while Malcolm is subdued. In the trial, she's depicted as somebody who is violent. The example that was given is by friends of theirs, the Lows, who went out with them one evening at a dance, and they had an argument, and Viola sort of pushed Malcolm down the stairs. Malcolm is seen as a caring and doting father. Viola, no surprise, is seen as a terrible mother, even though she is quite anxious to get custody before she was killed. She was worried that she wouldn't get custody of her son, so she was quite anxious about that. She's seen as somebody who swears. Malcolm, on the other hand, is so sweet, he won't even repeat the words in court. Judge Manson told the jury, "It is highly to the credit that this boy would not slander his wife. Even to the hour of her death, it seems, he is still in love with her, though why he should be, I do not know. Malcolm is seen as sobbing in trial. Viola is seen as sexually immoral. She's seen as having there's evidence apparently that she was having a letter writing relationship with a man in Ocala, and there are allegations that she had relationships with other men, but again, these are never really proven. What about the gun? Where did it come from? When the judge asked Malcolm about the gun, like how did he get the gun to kill Viola, he said that he found it in a paper bag on Broadway Street. And that's sufficient. That's it. There's no more questions asked. The jury settles on manslaughter, but recommends clemency. In Judge Manson's decision, he says, quote, upon the evidence, the jury doubtless found that after a preliminary quarrel, she returned to your room with the avowed intention of throwing you out, and it would seem clear that you had to resort to a revolver, which you had found by sheer accident the night before while walking the streets as you did for hours looking for her. Your shooting, I am satisfied, was entirely unpremeditated and was a shooting by a man who had, for the time being, lost control of himself. The provocation was very clear. Malcolm had suffered enough, Manson said. He was given a 7-year probation. In his trial judgment, Manson concluded by saying, the memory of your harrowing experience will be with you a long, long time. May that be your punishment. So in conclusion, throughout the Woolridge trial, the innocent character of Malcolm Woolridge remained intact. Viola, in contrast, is retroactively condemned to death because she did not fit the only mold available to her, that of a virtuous, self-sacrificing, dedicated wife and mother. In this case, it appears that the criminal was not so much defined by what he did, shooting his wife, but by what she was, seen as an immoral woman. Viola was the one on trial, not Malcolm. Pardon me? She deserved it? Yes, indeed, very good.
Wow.
Wow. Questions?
Yeah, what happened to Malcolm?
Yeah.
I tried looking him up, and I felt really awkward about it. But he was living about 10 years ago, I guess, maybe 15. He was living up in Kelowna, and I had his address, and I was so tempted to go there, but I didn't. And I looked him up more recently, and I can't find him. But I couldn't find an obit, so I'm not quite sure. And I don't know what happened to their son either. I don't know if their son ended up living with Malcolm or not.
Thank you, Diane. Other questions or comments from the floor?
Comments more related to the Bowman sign and so on. I know that in 1991 I had a gay friend who was assaulted by the Bowman sign at that part of Broadway. Simply because he was gay.
Yeah, how things change and don't change. I want to bring your attention also, kind of interesting as I was listening to you, Diane, which is, first of all, I would just like to say thank you.
Yes,
Diane Purvey, Katherine Rose, Erin Chapman. I really appreciated your presentations because I found actually this last presentation, Diane, really disturbing. It's one thing to look at a picture of a person dead, and when they're anonymous to us, it's just, oh, that's too bad. But all of a sudden, you tell me her name and you tell me her story, and I feel like I shouldn't be watching that. And clearly, it's a newspaper clipping. This is what we're supposed to see, these images. But I found that it was so harrowing to hear you tell her story and to see this condition and to know, again, in our city, we have boarding rooms and we have these lives that are just on the margins trying to make it through every day. And I found somehow the way you framed this very compelling, and I appreciated your narrative style and the quality of your research, so thank you very much.
And if I could just say, if you look on that photo, you can see the picture of Butch on the bureau.
Yes.
And the other thing that's really cool about this is that I knew about Viola and studied her, and then it was only when John and I were putting together another book, we were at the police archives, where Kat is. And that's when I came upon the photo. So I came upon the photo about 5 years after I did the research. So it was wonderful. I was so excited when I found her because this is the only visual image I have of her. And I know she's dead, but it's still, it was actually really, I don't know, I liked being able to see her.
Right.
Yeah. And the shoes, they're his shoes and then her one single shoe.
Yeah, I know, you really get a sense of the domestic environment. It's amazing. This was not in the newspaper, as I said. This was a police
They didn't show.
photo.
A crime scene photo?
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have just a few moments left, and I do invite you, as I mentioned, Helen Lawrence is based on the real history of the city, our crime and our politics, and it's been adapted for creative purposes, but it is built on the kind of research these authors have brought to you this evening. And I don't know when the last time you sat in the room with a crime analyst, but I'm kind of fascinated by your work, and I'm wondering if there's something you could say about what you've observed, how your profession worked in the days of yore, like that we just found a gun, and that the kind of crime analysis that happened then, and maybe what's happening now?
Do you want me to stand up again?
You do whatever's comfortable for you.
I guess that's a question that requires a bit of thought. I'm happy to say that we have learned a lot. In the policing world, I mean, even just in the past 10 or 20 years, since Picton in particular, policing has really changed a lot. And this, I think, with reference to this particular case, the whole, oh, well, I found the gun, that would never fly. Without some sort of hard forensic evidence, nobody would ever, nobody would ever believe that. It would just be seen, you might as well just keep your mouth shut rather than come out with some ridiculous story like that, I think is pretty much the idea. It kind of seems like now, eyewitness accounts and the things that people say really are not as important as what the science tells us these days. Courts and the public, and I'm sure there's, sort of, I guess we could call it the CSI effect here. That's what people want to see, and that is what people are willing to believe, and what they'll, that's what holds water in the criminal justice system today. And there's a real effort, I think, to sort of not judge, in particular, women or minorities based on character and perceived traits such as, morality and things. Whereas, as Diane sort of has just been talking about, that's really what's on trial. It's the victim's character, not the perpetrator.
Well, not unlike the milkshake drinker. The idea of a slovenly woman is just so abhorrent.
And a celebrity, male celebrity, charismatic.
Right? Exactly. Paraplegic athlete. Heavy duty. I thank you so much. Aaron, do you have any comments you want to close with?
One last thought, maybe just to leave and maybe something to end on is Vancouver is this often talked about as this sort of very pretty, beautiful place to live, where we have white-capped mountains and beaches and whatnot, and we talk about the beauty of the city. But at the heart of it, underneath all that, there is a dark, violent, fear and loathing-filled heart of our port city, and it's always been there. It's in Kerrisdale, it's in Chinatown, it's in every neighborhood, and I think you'll be able to read about it in Vancouver Confidential.
When does it come out?
We're
June?
end of the summer, probably feels like, or something. Yeah, depends how everything sort of goes for next month.
Great. Well, it's my hope. I'll talk with my people at the Arts Club Theatre Company, but we would probably be very happy to create a link to the Vancouver Confidential site. I know that we'll be letting you know by email at least when it comes out. So my hope is that you'll be able to continue to support the history of our city. And the more we know these stories and can tell these stories and let these stories and these histories live, the better. The better our city, the richer the experience and our capacity to value ourselves and this place where we're living. So I'm going to say thank you so much for your company. Thank you for your attendance and your good listening and your questions. It's our pleasure to be with you. If you'd like to leave your name and email with Gemma, who's been working with me here, we've got an Arts Club season guide as well as a flyer for Helen Lawrence. And if you're not already on our mail list, we'd be happy to keep you updated in that way. So I'd like to offer you a round of applause for being here with us tonight. Thank you very much. Safe journey home.